Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Bindal and Wulgarukaba peoples as the traditional owners of the lands and waters where we live and work, and honour their elders past, present and emerging. There is one housekeeping reminder. Audience members, please ensure your microphone is on mute during the talk. At the end of the presentation, we will open up the floor to questions, at which time you can unmute and turn on your video to ask a question or type questions into the chat box. So with that preamble, I am really pleased to introduce Paul Ferraro. For those of you who don't know, and I'm just looking at my EndNote, Paul produced a paper with a co-author in 2006 that I and many other people in conservation planning and conservation science regard as seminal. It was called Money for Nothing, ? A call for empirical evaluation of biodiversity conservation investments. That followed a number of years of Paul training his attention on conservation in the world, and it was seminal because it stood people up and said you need to be using counterfactual thinking, and I'm sure Paul will say some more about that during his seminar. Paul then went on to author or co-author a number of really important empirical studies that looked at the effectiveness of protected areas. He's trained his attention also on policy, the US Endangered Species Act, and with this seminar, he's going to talk to his work in Commonpool resources. So Paul, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bob. It's great to have this opportunity. I wish I could actually be there instead of doing it here in Baltimore. I was talking to Bob before, and I actually was in Australia many, many years ago, and I was a sophomore in college up on the Atherton Tablelands in a town called Milla. I didn't realize how good I had it there, and I don't know if you all realize how good you have it there, particularly on the beach, but I've been pining to come back and explore. It's a wonderful part of the world. So I'm going to give a talk today. This is the first time I'm giving this talk. It's on two related topics. So the benefit for you is you're the first to be able to see these other than my co-authors. The downside is I might be still working out some kinks in the presentation. So but before I get on with it, I just want to point out two centers that I'm co-directing because it fits into this whole money for nothing and the need for evaluation in conservation. So I direct or co-direct these two centers. Minimize the screen here for you all. Start with the premise that all environmental problems are human behavior problems, right? And so if we're not bringing insights from the behavioral sciences into the design of our environmental programs, we're probably going to be missing something important. So that's the first leg in the upper left-hand corner. But the bottom right is the one that connects to the evaluation. And it's this observation that we keep launching all these different initiatives. We change our programs all the time, but we keep doing these things in ways that make it really hard to learn. And every time we launch a program or change an existing program in a way that we can't learn, it's a missed opportunity. And in conservation science, it seems like it's mostly missed opportunities. So these two centers, CBEAR and EPIC. CBEAR works largely in the agricultural space on voluntary incentives for agriculture producers. EPIC works everything else, but focuses a lot on compliance and enforcement with environmental rules and regulations. And it works on trying to get practitioners to have a culture of experimentation. Every good idea that they've come up with in their offices, they treat it as a hypothesis to be tested through some kind of manipulation or experimentation. Doesn't have to be a randomized controlled trial, but those are often the easiest to do. And that's one thing I'm going to be talking about today is a randomized controlled trial. But taking advantage of all the things we do in the field to learn something, not just about what works and under what conditions, that's really important, but also to test this underlying model, these underlying models we have of what's causing the problem in these coupled human natural systems. So if you have any interest in trying to get practitioners to do some experimentation in a way that we can learn, and you think one of these centers could help you with that, feel free to reach out after the presentation. So today I'm going to be talking about measuring impacts or inferring one thing causes another. But I want to highlight this paper that came out, it's accepted in 2018, but came out in 2019 in PNAS. It was generally about how do you infer causality in coupled human and natural systems, but it focused, because of my co-authors, on the marine environment. And the sole purpose of the article was to highlight these two core assumptions in any study that's trying to figure out what causes what drives what, or what determines what in a coupled human and natural system. And the upper right-hand corner sort of sets up in a diagram what we're thinking about here. So we've got some kind of shock to our system, could be something like a hypoxic event, or could be human institutional related, like a marine protected areas put on the seascape. And that has some effect on some outcome Y. And so these arrows show the direction of causality in that picture. And the challenge for trying to infer whether or how much this shock S causes a change in Y is there are lots of things that affect the shock, where I see hypoxia, where I don't, where I see a marine protected area, where I don't, when I see them and when I don't, that also affect the outcome. And what's called the excludability assumption is this assumption that whatever variation in the shock that we're using to try to tease out the impact of S on Y can also have an arrow going to Y. So if I was an experimenter and I put myself in that box Z in the lower left-hand corner, I could randomize S, and then I could watch how it propagates through some mechanisms that affect some outcome like fish stocks at the end. The problem is that we can't randomize a lot of things that we care about in conservation, and so we're left with naturally occurring variation. And so the challenge is to try to eliminate those boxes O and U, things that have directions that go both to the shock and to the outcome. So all we're left with is variation that's coming from Z, whether we can see it or not, so that we can estimate the effect of S on Y. Right? And so that means that in any study that's trying to figure out, do marine protected areas work? Do changes of the way we do enforcement and compliance make people comply with the rules more in a common pool resource system? That we've got to explain why do we see values of S, the shock, in the way we see them spatially and temporally? Why is one area protected and another area is not? Why is one area gone hypoxic and another area is not? But when we read the conservation literature, and this is not just the marine protected area literature, but that's the one we focus on, we looked at 200 studies, nearly 200 MPA impact studies. Less than 10% characterize the source of spatial and temporal variation in marine protected area assignment. What that means is that you can't evaluate the credibility of those studies, causal inferences. Do the marine protected areas work? On what conditions, on what outcomes, under what conditions? Because it's impossible to evaluate the plausibility of that excludability assumption. So this was a paper highlighting that we're not actually focused on one of the core things we need to be focused on, and therefore we very likely have a large amount of bias in the studies that we're seeing in the environmental literature, and particularly in the conservation literature that I'm most interested in. The paper also focuses on this other assumption that's a core assumption called interference. I'm not going to talk about that, but that just basically is another challenge for inferences when the effect of a particular shock at a particular location at a particular time depends on whether or not other areas are also experiencing shocks or not, which in most coupled human natural systems, that's an issue. And when we don't take that into account, again, inferences become challenging. And the key thing is this isn't just noise in the system, because we won't solve this bias problem that's in our studies with more sample size. Right? It has to be better designs. And if you want to see more details, you can take a look at the paper. But today I want to talk about this other problem that we have, that even if we get rid of all this bias in our study designs, We have a problem that we as scientists faced incentives that are not necessarily aligned with the best science. What I mean by this is maybe you've heard about this idea of replicability crises that are going on in different disciplines. We've heard of phrases like p-hacking or harking. These are all tied to this problem we have in science, whether it's for academic science or even government scientists or NGO scientists, is that we're often rewarded for finding interesting things. Interesting in terms of their magnitudes, interesting in terms of their statistical significance. So with two ecologists, Caitlin Kimball and Megan Ovolio at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, we looked at over 350 empirical studies that are recent in 5 popular journals. So 3 of them are pure ecology, and then we took the ecology pages out of Nature and Science. And this picture here is just plotting the t-statistics and all of the hypothesis tests from 0 to 10. We cut it off. There's a very small tail that goes a little beyond it. And under normal conditions, where people are just going through doing their science, we should see, starting from 10 and moving towards 0, some smoothly increasing function, some monotonic function as the density is going up as we get to smaller t-statistics. But in this picture, we don't. We see a camel, this double humped pattern, where it goes up steeply as we approach 1.96 and then drops off a cliff. Now, Bob made you all mute, so I can't ask for someone to volunteer. What's special about 1.96? Okay. So I'll answer the question myself. That's the threshold for the p-value equal to 0.05, which is in many fields, including conservation, is the magical number when we do statistical inference, that we find an effect. And if it's 0.06, we might write it's weak evidence. If it's 0.11, well, then we write there's no evidence. So in the main text tables, there's this weird pattern where we're not seeing a lot of low t statistics. I know, why might that be? Well, it could be publication biases, that the studies with those lower t statistics are just not getting published because they're less interesting, they're harder to publish. Could be these other practices that go under a variety of rubrics, but one of them is called researcher degrees of freedom. Researchers look at the results and then start making decisions. Maybe I should throw away some of this data. Maybe it was contaminated in those years, those places. Maybe I should change the estimation method. Oh, here's an interesting pattern. Maybe I should rewrite my introduction to be about this pattern, not what I originally was trying to study. And so there's a lot of these often called questionable research practices that we all do. Right? So I don't want to point fingers. We've all convinced ourselves that certain decisions make scientific sense and also happen to make the paper a lot more interesting when we do it. Right? And this is a problem because the things in the literature that we're reading don't actually reflect what is likely to be reality. The other interesting thing is that we're finding lots of statistically significant results in ecology papers, which would suggest that there must be really high statistical power. And I'm not going to talk about the methods we use for that, but we try to characterize the median statistical power of the test in these recent empirical studies, and we calculate to be 14%. So if you know what statistical power is, and there's a little definition there at the bottom if you've forgotten what it is, people tend to go for a conventional value of 80%. That's like the ugly stepchild to p equals 0.05, is the power equals 80%. So ecology studies, by and large, are grossly underpowered, yet they're finding lots of statistically significant results. And when you talk to people about low power, their first reaction is, well, that just means, we can't find effects should they exist, right? We have type 2 errors. The underappreciated problem is that with low power, you're going to get a lot of variability in the effects that any particular studies or set of studies are going to generate. And the only estimates that are going to generate a statistically significant value by the p equals 0.05 criterion are things that are grossly overestimated, grossly higher, or maybe in the other direction, lower than the true effect. Because those are the only ones that are going to pass the threshold for the statistical test. So this leads to what's called exaggeration bias, right? Now, if everything got published and we did lots of replications, there was no bias, we'd see, okay, there's some high values, there's some low values, even some negative ones, the opposite sign. But on average, we see the effect is modest, a tenth of a standard deviation effect or something like that. But the problem is if only the statistically significant stuff is getting published, or by and large, there's a bias toward that, that means that everything we see in the literature is exaggerated. And so we go through, again, using methods that are in the statistical literature to try to characterize the exaggeration bias in the ecology literature. We're finding almost 2/3 of the reported effects are exaggerated by a factor of 2 or more. Almost half are exaggerated by a factor of 3 or more. That little, I realize now that those little boxes don't actually match my percentages. I'll have to fix that, but the numbers are correct in here. All right, so that again, this sort of interacts with the slide on the other, the picture on the other slide to suggest that we're not seeing reality when we read our journals and our articles. And we did a survey just to see, well, do ecologists already know this, right? Maybe they're already aware of it. I'm not claiming it's representative. I mean, we broadcast the invitations. If any of you answered it, thank you for doing that. 238 ecologists, we asked them to estimate the average number of statistical tests in our set of studies. We described what we had done that passed the 80% threshold for power. The punchline is 88% estimated that the power would be 50% or more. Oh, sorry, that 50% or more of the tests in our data set would be adequately powered at 80%. And only 3% of respondents selected the correct bin, which was between 10 and 20%. So ecologists are not aware. They're aware that there's low power, but they don't realize just how low the statistical power is in their literature. And we're not the first to say this. Some have done it for subfields like wildlife ecology. We're doing it for a much broader set of articles and finding the same thing that others have found. And again, this is a problem because of the incentives we face. So I don't know if you saw this. This just came out last week. This paper in Science Advances, I should put, oh, it's down there, the journal, where they found in fields where there have been replication, so you can actually see whether they're typically experiments, have they been replicated or not, that the non-replicable publications are cited more often than the ones that actually replicate. And they have some hypotheses for why that is, but the basic idea is because those non-replicable ones tend to be those exaggerated ones that get all the attention. They get media attention, donor attention, scientist attention, yet they're not generally going to replicate because of all these problems we talked about before and other ones that we talk about in our paper, other practices that are done that I'm not going to go over here. And so the experiment I'm about to talk about, or this project I'm about to talk about, is going to try to address the issue of biases that we often see in the literature and these incentive problems that we face as researchers to make choices that may not be in the best interest of science, that may be more interesting for publications. So we're going to try to follow some of these best practices. I'm listing some of them here. I'll talk about the first one in more detail later, pre-registration and pre-analysis plans. That basically means we're trying to tie our hands before we see the results so that we can't then go, well, maybe I should change that hypothesis a little bit, or maybe I should change the outcome measure that I think is the best one to use, something like that. Some journals are starting to use some checklists to get people to at least report properly. Do you put out data and code sharing requirements so that people can see how people got to the results they got? Register reports and results blind reviews are being tested in a couple of different places. Conservation biology now has a registered report pathway where you actually submit your study before anybody sees the results. So the reviewer has to judge, is the question important? Is the design appropriate for the question they're trying to answer? They don't get to say whether or not it's worth publication based on the answer that you get from the study. You have to focus on the science itself. And then there's some work on changing incentives that we're going to talk about a few of those in the project that I'm working on. But ultimately, there's a systemic change that needs to take place is we've got to change our norms and expectations. Our norms about what high quality ecology or conservation research should look like, and our expectations about what high quality ecological studies can deliver. There's a new group called Sortie. I know there's some Australians involved in that group for open, reliable, and transparent ecology that's trying to trailblaze in that context. And if you're interested in that, I recommend you go to their website. Hopefully our paper will soon be out. And I put this little note for myself because I don't know how many of you are modelers. Like, I'm talking about statistical inference, taking data and trying to draw inferences. And a lot of you may be modelers where you're simulating outcomes, right? Modelers, you have even more degrees of freedom, right? It's even more a problem, I think, in your literature, although no one's looked, it's not as easy to detect the fingerprints of these questionable research practices. But I'm in an engineering department, or at least half of me is, and I don't think I've ever met a modeler who's ever said, does X matter? That's their question, and come up with an answer that isn't, oh yeah, X matters a hell of a lot. So we all face these incentives, at least in the area of statistical inference, we might be able to do something about it. So here's the project that I wanted to talk about today with Commonpool resources. So Lynn Ostrom, political scientist, giant in her field, won a Nobel Prize in economics, largely on the basis of this book, Governing the Commons, and a lot of work that went around it and before it and after it. And it was really just a demonstration that communities could successfully manage Commonpool resources without resorting to individual property rights or central government control, which had been sort of the extreme viewpoints in fields up to that point. So basically did a proof by counterexample by showing that communities could indeed manage Commonpool resources. And it could be co-managed with centralized authorities or independent of those centralized authorities. But the problem with the literature is it doesn't really answer two important questions for applied science or sustainability science or for conservation. Can success be facilitated by external actors, or we just have to wait until communities get on the ball and manage their resources better? Can we intervene and induce better outcomes? And if so, if we can do that, must we target all the institutional factors at once? I mean, in her book, she identifies 9 very large categories of features that are conducive to success. People have followed on her heels, and there are dozens of these key design features that need to be done to get successful Commonpool resource management. It's not clear if we have to actually hit all of them at once, which would be a huge challenge, or we can hit them as individual levers and improve resource outcomes. And those are the questions that this project, which is funded by DFID in the UK and managed by a network of political scientists called EGAP, it was designed to look at. And in a nutshell, what it was a coordinated set of interventions in 6 countries to estimate the impact that community monitoring or citizen monitoring of Commonpool resource status and trends has on subsequent resource extraction and quality. Community monitoring is one of these key design features that Ostrom identified as associated with success in Commonpool resource management by communities. And one interesting thing that I was not aware of before I got involved in this project is I was aware of the resource commons literature and community monitoring's role in that, but there are these other literatures out there, some of which I knew of, like the citizen science, where we get citizens go out and measure things, water quality, bird densities, things like that. But I didn't realize how much literature there was in these different fields with getting communities engaged in monitoring of natural resources. So there's a citizen science that's trying to improve scientific knowledge of resource systems and the environment, and getting the monitors to provide information that would be costly for scientists to get on their own. The adaptive management literature in the last 10, 15 years has been looking at using community monitoring as a way to improve system performance by getting information to the managers that otherwise would be difficult or costly to acquire. And then there's this whole literature in political science and in development, economic development, about using community monitoring to hold institutions and decision makers accountable, the authorities accountable. And the idea is to increase the transparency of decision making, reducing corruption and mismanagement, and improving public good outcomes. And this this project, this coordinated set of studies, tries to draw on all of these literatures to think about how to measure the impact of community monitoring on natural resources. But the literature is huge, but most of the studies are descriptive. They're case studies, or they're the determinants of common pool resource success, or they're correlational studies. They're not aimed at causal inference. Does a change in community monitoring actually lead to improvement in resource outcomes? And most studies in the Common Pool resource literature examine endogenous community monitoring, monitoring that naturally arises within communities. But as I said before, policymakers are interested in whether monitoring can be created where it doesn't exist now, or enhanced where it exists but is weak, and whether that encouragement from the outside leads to better outcomes. So the project is called a Metacata, which is a Basque word for accumulation or stacking, because the idea is that it's trying to get knowledge that we can accumulate and move forward, advance. There's this fear that we're doing lots of studies, but because of these problems I pointed out before, we're not actually accumulating knowledge. We're not advancing knowledge. And all these studies will be coming out in a special feature in July called Sustaining the Commons in PNAS. And the Metacata was focused on trying to address the internal validity challenges of that bias issues that we talked about before, trying to emphasize causal inference. And it does that in a couple of ways. One, by randomizing community monitoring across communities. Two, by having a very elaborate theory that's mechanism-based and trying to collect data on changes in the mechanisms as well as the resource status. On the external validity challenge, this idea that how do we generalize across context? They're going to do it in multiple sites with different sorts of natural resources, different sorts of common pool resources. And it's going to try to do a meta-analysis that comes out of the studies themselves to try to improve generalizability. And then it's going to try to address these investigator incentive challenges, incentives to make decisions that make our papers look better, but don't necessarily get us closer to the truth. All right, so the Metacata has 4 guiding principles. The first one is to harmonize the research questions and study designs across the study sites. Because one of the problems in accumulating knowledge is that scientists get no credit for doing the same study that someone else has done. And so what we do is we do something similar, but we extend it. We do different resource outcomes, or we use a different estimation methodology, or we have a different sort of resource that we might be looking at, and we're going to measure its outcomes in different ways, or we're going to measure the mechanisms in different ways. And the problem is that then it becomes hard to accumulate knowledge, because every study is different in ways that make it hard to aggregate. By harmonizing the research questions and the study designs across study sites, we make it easier. So there was a meta model, essentially, of the channels through which encouraging community monitoring would affect outcomes in each of the countries. And then each country would have their own model. They were done in this theory of change format so that everybody could understand it, whether or not they've got any technical expertise in causal inference, where it tries to identify what are the steps in the process that goes from encouraging monitoring to getting better resource outcomes, or in this case also they were interested in the users being more satisfied with the resource outcomes. So this one is from one of the studies in Costa Rica that was focused on groundwater extraction. And there are a bunch of channels you can see. At the top is that accountability channel. The management committee believes the community is watching closely its performance. There are the information channels in the middle, where the manager gets better information about the conditions and therefore can do a better job of managing. There's another accountability channel down at the third, where the community gets more engaged in the water system problems and they demand better performance from the manager. And then there's the channel that you often see in Elinor Ostrom's work, where the community believes they're being watched closely by monitors. They may be sanctioned for illegal uses, or whether that sanctions financial or through social norms in the community. And that leads to better management and so on. And so all the studies try to harmonize this, collect information all along the causal path, to try to understand if things are working in the way in which people hypothesized. second guiding principle is putting these constraints on researcher degrees of freedom. So that means pre-register designs, put a pre-analysis plan. So it's posted online, a public repository. What are our research questions? How are we going to study this stuff? We got third-party replication. So we make sure it can be replicated by a third party. Everything's going to be public at the end. Here, I just want to talk about the pre-registration, the pre-analysis plan. Why is this so important? So this is a picture from the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute in the United States, showing treatment effects from clinical trials before and after the year 2000. These are just relative risk ratios. So 1 means there's no difference between the treatment and control, and then less than 1 means that the treatment reduced the risk, because they're usually bad outcomes, bad health outcomes. So health people want to see negative effects from these treatments. Positive effect mean that the treatment made things worse. And what you can see is before 2000, there's lots of negatives in the right direction. We're improving health with these treatments. Most of them are statistically significant. There's a few things that are going the wrong direction, but they're not statistically significant. Then in 2000, this institute that does a lot of the funding required registration of the primary outcomes, which means they have to register their hypothesis and what's the specific outcome you're going to measure. You don't get to choose, sift through all the data and find the one that's most favorable. And look at what happens to the effect sizes. They all collapse toward 1. You get 2 statistically significant ones that are in the right direction, 1 that's in the wrong direction, and most everything else is huddled around no effect or little effect, can't detect anything. Right? And this is not because statistical power changed across that time threshold. Right? It's not a causal analysis, so there may be some rival explanations, but most people can't think of any other than the registration requirement. And this kind of graph exists in lots of other fields. When you require pre-registration, suddenly all the wow effects become really scarce. The other 2 guiding principles are synthesis and integrated publication. I'm not going to talk about those here. Meta-analysis, I'll present the results of. And integrated publication is just trying to get over the problem. No one wants to be the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th study in a particular area. Right? So by simultaneously publishing them all at the same time, everybody's first in the teams. All right, so let me describe in the last 10 minutes what we did and what we found. All right, so there's 6 countries, different continents, different resources, groundwater, surface water, forests, different kinds of communities from rural villages to urban micro neighborhoods, different threats to these common pool resources. By and large, they're harmonized to have community workshops where they select, train, and give incentives to monitors who then monitor the resource. They disseminate that information to citizens, and they disseminate it to management bodies. You can see that there's a little bit of variation there. The asterisks talk about a 3rd treatment arms in there, but it's not that important here. But they're roughly harmonized. They'll be very similar in these attributes. And the key thing is that they're all experiments. Some of them added some other treatments to it. They're not huge sample sizes. You know, we see 80 communities treated in a few of the studies, and then the others have fewer. But the nice thing about that is we're going to be able to aggregate them up and get more statistical power in the meta-analysis. Most of them, because of DFID funding, are short-term for this study, which isn't great because we know that a lot of times these effects wane. In some cases, they may actually mature and get better, but more generally, they tend to wane. And then they had different compliance measures, different resource outcomes, and all of them had end-line surveys of the citizens or the users involved in those communities, or living in those communities. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip this idea of consequential variation, but it's in the intro paper that I wrote with Arun Agrawal. But it's just this issue of, again, how do we aggregate across these different studies? They are harmonized in some respects, but they're often different in other respects. And when we see heterogeneity, how do we know what's causing that heterogeneity? Is it the context difference? Is it the difference in the actual interventions? There are different versions of community monitoring. And so, you know, there's still challenges here that the special issue has to wrestle with. But here are the results. So the first result is that, yes, external encouragement can lead to monitoring, right? You can enhance monitoring. So this is the proportion of communities engaged in monitoring by the quarter after the intervention. Brazil had problems with its compliance, but all the other countries got a fair amount of monitoring, but not necessarily 100%. There's always some non-compliant monitors that did not monitor. But by and large, they could externally encourage monitoring. And the question is, does that lead to changes in the resource status? And so these are all standardized effects by a standard deviation of the control group so that you can compare across the different resource contexts. And the idea here is that community monitoring wanted to reduce extraction or damage of the resource. So the negative Orthland is where the conservationists were hoping to see the effect. And that's what we largely see. China is roughly at 0, but the others are in the negative direction, but they've got large confidence intervals. But they're all in the anticipated direction. And when you combine them all, as they do at the bottom in the red, you see a more precisely estimated modest treatment effect of about 1/10 of a standard deviation, reduction in extraction or use of the Commonpool resource. And the reductions in resource use, you can't see it here, but from other analyses, are greatest in the higher decile levels of resource extraction. So those communities that had the highest level of resource extraction, and also based on another measure where experts deemed the CPR management problem was deemed most severe. And if you're wondering about this effect size, if you actually ever thought about effects, you might think that's modest. But if you look at meta-analyses or studies of terrestrial protected areas, payments for environmental service programs, information-based strategies, and other conservation fields, they roughly get very similar effect sizes. And whether this would persist or not over time, beyond a year, we won't know until we go back and collect more data. But there seems to be an effect. And you can't see it here in this picture, but because of all that extra data they collected and these elaborate mechanistic theories that they used to underlie the design, the evidence seems to favor the accountability mechanism. Here you can see one piece of evidence is China didn't have the accountability mechanism to the management authorities, and it's got the smallest treatment effect. The others had them in differing degrees. Costa Rica, Uganda, and Peru actually had the largest amount of dissemination to management authorities. You see larger effects. And each of the individual studies found evidence consistent with the accountability channel being the important one. And that's interesting because the Commonpool resource literature doesn't really focus on accountability mechanism like you see in the political science literature. There are other outcome measures that are in here on user satisfaction, user knowledge about the resource itself, stewardship attitudes. I'm not going to talk about those, but by and large, there seems to be modest evidence that you can externally create community monitoring that at least persists for a year, and that can lead to reductions in resource extraction. And it seems like it's most likely to work in contexts where there is either a management authority at the community level, like a forest management committee or a groundwater management committee, or at higher level, like a regional level. Someone who, when they have this information or this pressure, can then enforce rules on the system, in the system. All right, with that, I'm going to wrap it up and open it up to questions.